to welcome all of you to this dedication of the Mrs. C.M. Schwab portrait. As you can see, it turned out to be quite a masterpiece. Most of you here, I imagine, have seen this portrait many times as it hung in the old Schwab building, and as we trotted through the halls, and as we came into and went out of the main entrance in the old Schwab building. But I think that perhaps at that time we sort of took the picture for granted, having seen it time after time after time, and we didn't realize that it would have sentimental value in the future. In my school days, I graduated in 1942. In my school days, I can still remember passing by that picture and seeing somebody standing there in front of it with his elbow on the railing and a scowl on his face, and hollering at one of the kids that went by every now and then. And you other old-timers know who that was. That was Professor R.V. Legislator, standing there guarding the picture. Most of us have not seen the portrait since those early school days, however, and it's rather a thrill and a delight to see it hanging here now in all its glory, fully restored and in a beautiful glass case here, and which is in itself a masterpiece if you haven't looked at it closely. Look at it after the ceremony. Many people have worked on this project. Some have been paid, some have done it without pay. And a few of those people, the president of the Weatherly Citizens Committee is going to recognize in a few minutes. But there is one person whose name I feel sure the president will not mention. And that's a person who has spent many more hours than anybody else doing volunteer work on this project. And that's the person who initiated the project and saw it through from beginning to end. And that person, of course, is Mrs. Betty Henry, the president of the Weatherly Citizens Committee. I remember attending a school board meeting about a year and a half ago, and at that meeting the school board announced that they would not provide any funds for the restoration of this picture. And at that point, Betty Henry, who was not president of the WCC then because it wasn't formed yet, but she got up and she said or asked the school board, well, now if we can get a group of citizens together and if we can collect enough money, do you have a place and will you hang this picture in the new building when it's built? And of course the school board's answer was yes. And since that time, Betty Henry has been guiding the whole operation up to this point. And this is the fruit of her labor here. In view of that, I think that it would be appropriate now if we would commend Betty Henry and show our appreciation for a job well done by giving her a good hand. Here, but the committee is gratified to see so many of you here, and we welcome you, and we would like to also announce that immediately following the ceremony there will be free refreshments downstairs in the cafeteria, and we're all invited to get down there. I'd like to now turn the meeting over to Jack Taylor, who will give us a short brief history of the portrait itself.
Like Timmy said, this picture never really meant that much to all of us going to school because we'd walk in the front door and there it was and you keep on going by it. And Mr. Laudensinger stand there, but anytime you're out of line, he would holler, "Hey, bud," and you were quiet. And it looked like she was looking right over the shoulder, walking right at you. And a number of people used to say walking up and down by, looked like her eyes would follow them back and forth. Some people didn't like that. But anyhow, little history on the portrait. I want to go back a little further to Mr. and Mrs. Schwab. I don't know how many people know who is Mrs. Schwab, but people ask me on the street, is that the Schwab that sells insurance on TV? I said, no. Charles Schwab was born back in Williamsburg in 1862. And Mrs. Eurana Dinky was born here in Pennsville, near Lehighton, in 1858. And of course, her family moved to Weatherly. And her father opened up a bakery business down on Carmen Street, or Wilbur Street, where E&R Plumbing now is. And he ran the bakery business for about a year. Then they left town and went back to a farm down near Lehighton. And her husband was killed, and so the family moved back to Weatherly in 1872. A lot of the history I put a little flyer in there because people aren't going to remember dates and facts, but I just wanted to give you a little background of who Mrs. Schwab was. And they came back to town again, and they moved on 14 First Street, which is the old Dr. Matthews building, and later moved in with a sister by the Gilbert House. She had a sister living in town. And to help her mother out, Mrs. Schwab and her sister and her two brothers would go down and pick huckleberries along the railroad and pick coal. Now, I'm maybe considered one of the older generation. I remember picking coal and picking huckleberries too. And it was a way of earning a little extra income for the family. And Mrs. Schwab did this. Then they moved out of town and they went out to Braddock, Pennsylvania, and she opened a boarding house there. And who, of all people, comes into the boarding house looking for a place to room was Charlie Schwab. He was working in a little local grocery store. And he boarded there at Mrs. Dinky's house. And that's where he met Eurana. And of course, a few years later, in 1883, they were married. And he became president of the Carnegie Steel Company. Then he became president of U.S. Steel. And finally moved east and got charge of the Bethlehem Steel. So while he was building this big mansion in New York on Riverside Drive, he had hired Richard Hall to paint a picture of Mrs. Schwab in 1906. And he painted this as an oil on canvas. And I think the size was 8 feet 3 inches by 5 feet 6 inches with a 10-inch frame around it, which we say today 6 foot by 9 foot. And it's a huge frame. And now this man that painted Richard Hall, he was a portrait artist, but he did like to paint mountainsides and landscapes. And he studied under Lorenz, who was a noted portrait. Richard Hall was born in Finland of Swedish parents, and some of his paintings have been shown in Helsinki, Stockholm, England, and even was painted down in Argentina. When Mr. Schwab died on January 12th of 1939, he had to break up the Riverside mansion because he was having financial troubles. And he didn't know where to go with this huge painting. So he wrote, I have a copy of the original letters that used to stand inside the old frames. Mr. Schwab wrote to the Willie Burra, asking if they could take this picture. He said, I'm dismantling my New York residence since Mrs. Schwab's death. In this residence, I have a very famous portrait of Mrs. Schwab, which is hanging in the middle of my picture gallery. Now, his picture gallery hung in this Riverside mansion, which was a 2-story gallery. Now, imagine how many pictures and portraits in that 2-story gallery of a 70-room mansion on Riverside Drive, which took up a whole city block. But he had no place to go when he was dismantling the mansion. He had an apartment, and he couldn't fit in the apartment, and wouldn't fit in any other place, so he asked the Willie Burra if they would take this picture. And of course, Willie Burra sent a letter back through their Burgess A.H. Workman, stating that the town would be very glad to have it, and it would be an honor to have her picture. But where were they going to go with it? There was talk at Borough Council of building a little building out by Eurana Park and then putting this in the building. But they're afraid of the weather and the dampness, it wouldn't go. So they contacted the school board, and the school board says we could put it in the main hallway of the Schwab School, where it's remained for the next 52 years. When the school was closed in the term of 1990 and 91, we felt that something had to be done with the picture because there was going to be no home for it. So we contacted an artist. We had an appraiser come in. This is Nancy Metchinger from Kingston. She appraised it at $10,000 to $25,000 on the retail market today. $25,000 is retail on the market. Brian Howard, who was an artist, he said he could take the picture and redo it. So in June 22nd, 1991, they came and they removed this picture out of the old Schwab building. The glass creation company came and took the old frame and glass down so they could get the picture off the wall. And went out to Carlisle to his studio for 6 months. It was returned in January of this year, January 25th, and it was rehung on this new wall, and Glass Creations again installed a new frame around it. And so Mr. Schwab is still a part of our heritage as long as it hangs here. And we should never forget our heritage because Mr. and Mrs. Schwab did a lot for Weatherly. Eurana Park down there was given to the community on August 23rd, 1913, on Weatherly's 50th anniversary of being incorporated as a borough. And so many newcomers don't know who Mrs. Schwab is. This is part of our Weatherly heritage, Mr. and Mrs. Schwab. Thank you.
52 years that the picture hung in the hall of the old school. I was Mrs. Schwab's principal for 22 years. Every time you went out in the hall, as Timmy said, you would look down the hall and she was looking at you. You'd walk over to the middle, she was looking at you. You'd go over to the other side, she was looking at you. So I became quite used to seeing Mrs. Schwab as she was there. I heard many stories from people downtown when I would go down to the drugstore for a cup of coffee, telling me about how many hours were spent admiring this painting. Mr. Lonslater and I guess Mr. Ron later on had people stand and guard the painting. This particular lobby that you're in right now was built especially for this painting, and it really makes it possible to appreciate it a lot more than the older building because of the size of the ceiling. One time when the board, when I first came here, had the painting appraised, someone from the Museum of Art in Philadelphia came, and the gentleman said one of the problems over there was that the ceiling wasn't high enough to appreciate how beautiful the painting was. The wall was built to bring out the additional beauty of the painting, along with the work that was done by the committee in getting the lighting and the setting in the hall where you have a much further area back. It really is an outstanding addition to the building. I would like to thank everyone who has contributed, and especially Mrs. Henry and her committee, to doing this for the community of Weatherly and also for the school. We hope she will stand here as long as she has in the old building. And we really appreciate what Mr. Schwab has done for Weatherly in the past. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Betty Henry, President of the Weatherly Citizens Committee. How pleased I am to see all of you here today on this joyous occasion. What you see here today is a result of many hours of hard work and that began with the beginning of our first meeting, January the 16th, 1991. On that day, while we were conducting our meeting, the United States declared war on the Gulf. That was quite an occasion when you went home and found that out. Our group was organized because of the threat that Mrs. Schwab's portrait was to be sent who knows where, because of school board's inability to afford funds for the restoration. Thanks to all of you here today, we have our portrait still in Weatherly where it belongs. Mr. and Mrs. Charles Schwab are an important part of the town's history, and I am glad we have retained part of it. Now, at this time, I would like to give a summary of work done by our committees, and to thank everyone for all their time and hard work they put into this project. Thank you all so much. The letter summary committee did an excellent job of collecting names and addresses of Weatherly High School graduates. They addressed and stuffed 2,265 envelopes, which resulted in 498 returns. The Restoration Committee took care of the portrait, frame, and case. They researched and got bids from many reputable portrait restorers. After many phone calls, they came back to us with their reports. We voted to have Mr. Brian Howard of Carlisle, Pennsylvania, to do the portrait and frame. The portrait was taken down from the old high school June 20th, 1991, and returned here January 25th, 1992. Mr. Howard cleaned every inch of this portrait with cotton swabs. That's how he did that. He had a chemical and they went over the whole picture inch by inch with cotton swabs. Details and color in the portrait that have faded over the years are now back to their original glory. There is one spot of the frame left undone as evidence of the tremendous difference the restoration made. When you get time, right up in the very, very corner there's a real dark spot about so big. And he left that undone. That's the way the frame was when he took it. And you'll see what the difference is. Also, he left a piece of bubble gum on the bottom of the frame. You have to get down on your hands and knees. But it's about the second swirl of, over, underneath, way underneath. But there's a big hunk of bubble gum there. He said he had to leave that on because that was part of the picture. Our hats are off to you, Mr. Howard, for making our Mrs. Schwab portrait beautiful again. After a few phone calls, Mr. John Craig of Glass Creations in Hazleton was given the job of building the case. It was very interesting seeing the case installed. The front piece of glass weighs 400 pounds, this piece here. That was amazing to see that being installed. It was very interesting. He also took down the old case over at the old high school. He worked hard on the design and did a fantastic job. Research on the artist was done by Mr. Ed Young. He is our school librarian. History of the portrait was done by who else but Jack Kaler. If you want to know anything about Weatherly, just ask Jack. Our person in charge of publicity, Paula Thomas, did a good job letting the public know about our meetings and progress of the portrait. The documentary committee participated in a small film about the history and restoration of the portrait. When complete, this can be viewed on PCTV television station in the future. Now we would want to thank Mr. Robert Decker for donating the paper for our programs. We want to thank Mr. and Mrs. George Hayden of Hayden Electric, Hazleton, who donated the materials and labor for the installation of the spotlights. He was given short notice, but he got it done for us. We appreciate it and thank you. The photographer, Mr. John Novotnik, took pictures of the portrait before restoration and after when she was returned here. He gave a lot of his time and we thank you very much. We thank the Weatherly Area School District for their cooperation. Now, will Mr. and Mrs. Gantz please come forward? We have saved a very special thank you for Mr. and Mrs. Gantz. The Weatherly Citizens Committee planted the seed to save the portrait, but the generous donation by the Gantz family quickly caused that seed to grow into maturity. The Gantz told us that Weatherly gave them their start in the cable TV business, and this was their way of thanking us. Now, Mr. and Mrs. Gantz, it is our turn to say thank you. You hold a special place in our hearts, and you play a large part in our being here today. We, the Weatherly citizens, present you with the token of our gratitude for your kindness. Mr. Novotny took the photo of that, and he's, whatever he had to do, he got that for us. And we really appreciate that, too. Okay, Mrs. Pilecki was supposed to be here, but she couldn't make it. She had to leave town on business, so Mr. McMonigle is going to take her place. As president of the Weatherly Citizens Committee, I, Betty Henry, present to you Mr. McMonigle, principal of the Weatherly Area High School, the restored portrait of Mrs. Eurana Schwab. It's all yours. I want to thank all of you for coming, and there are refreshments downstairs in the cafeteria. I wish you would all go down and enjoy yourself and visit with one another. This is a very joyous occasion.